Hey all, we've been looking at a number of cases in the past few weeks where we have seen pre-literate peoples, that is, people who don't have writing systems, and so we've been forced to see the history only through the eyes of the colonizers. So, for example, in the slave trade, we didn't see any African sources, we only saw European sources on Africans. And we face the exact same thing um, with indigenous peoples. So for written records, we rely on records of settler colonizers to understand their history. Not entirely, and we'll certainly see instances later on in the course where that's not entirely the case. But it's certainly the predominant basis for most of the sources we use in writing these histories. This is also true for illustrations, and that's really what I want to talk about here today. I want to take you through a couple of images of so-called Indian villages made over the span of about 140, 150 years. And I want to show you something kind of puzzling about them and how we might want to think differently about them when we see such images. I want to begin here. This is an image drawn in 1585 by a man named John White, who was part of an early English expedition to what becomes Virginia. And he sketches a watercolor of an Algonquian village called Pauiok. And this shows up, there's a little description at the bottom. You can go back and look at it later. But I want you to see the basic arrangement here, which are longhouses, much like Iroquoian longhouses. And there's a fenced area around the village for protection. Note the road coming out at the bottom left there. This group of people gathered in some sort of ceremony, a feast of some sort. Looks like it's going on in the center. Smoke coming up, perhaps cooking something for a meal feast or something. But you can see certainly the general outlines of this picture. Here's another image from 1586, and it's very similar. You can see it's almost identical. But it's drawn in 1586 by a Dutch engraver by the name of Theodore de Bry. And this gets used in a book published in the 1590s about Virginia. And this is an actual image from the book, so it's a black and white. It's a book print, an engraved image based on the earlier print. But you can see it's pretty much identical. Here is another version that shows up in a map from 1632, so about 40 years later, from a Dutch map made in New Amsterdam, modern day New York, in 1632. And you can see in the upper right hand side there an image of that village again. And it's not exactly the same. This one seems more regularly lined up, but this is a small detail on a map, on a larger map. And you can see the basic arrangement is exactly the same. The palisaded village, even the gateway on the lower left. So really largely similar image that we're seeing there. This is 50 years later, another Dutch cartographer, Nicholas Vischer. He borrows this image as well. You can see it here in the upper left-hand side there. And it's kind of decorating the margin there. And he places this amongst what he calls the Susquehanna people, which are people related to the Iroquoian peoples of modern-day Ontario and New York. But again, it's the same image. It's reversed. You can see that the road comes out the right-hand side instead of the left-hand side. But again, it's pretty much the same image. Here's another one, 35 years after the last one. This one by an English cartographer, Herman Mall, very famous cartographer from the 18th century. This is one of his early maps of America, produced in 1720. And you can see the same village, now again a Susquehanna village, an Iroquoian village, now in western Pennsylvania, and it's not an Algonquian village, which the Virginian one had been, but it seems to be a kind of generic vision of what an Indian village looks like. And again, it's the circular palisade, the longhouses. This one even has the feast going on in the center. We see more people in the foreground in this one, but there's generally a lot more stuff in the background and foreground of this one anyhow, so that doesn't really tell us too much. But certainly the basic outline of the village looks pretty much exactly the same. So these illustrations are really well known. They show up in textbooks all the time. And what they're usually there to show us is It's an illustration of an Indian village or an indigenous village. They allow us, in some ways, to see, to visualize the past. And that's really fabulous. That's really, really helpful. But the problem is, if all these images are just kind of recycled versions of each other, well, then what are we really seeing? Do we actually know that John White image from 1585, do we know that that's an accurate drawing? Do we know anything about the accuracy of that drawing? Was he more or less making it up? Had a friend of his who had journeyed inland and seen such a village told him about it and drawn that thing? We don't know. We simply don't know. We do know that pretty much everybody else is copying what he's done afterward. So what it means is that all these different images are really the same image, and we really don't know that that's a good image of what we're imagining we're seeing. I'll show you one more example. This is from Nova Scotia. Well, I shall see Nova Scotia and Quebec, but it's another nice illustration of this. Two paintings here. The one on the top shows Quebec in the background, across the river, and the one in the foreground, the bottom, shows Halifax in the background, with Indigenous people in the foreground again. And they're almost identical compositions. The arrangements of the canoe, the arrangements of the people, all of these basic configurations. The guy in the center of the bottom one, you can see he's stepping away from the canoe. He's striding forth with the paddle in hand. Upper image, exact same thing. Look in particular at the family grouping on the lower right, the top image, and lower right on the bottom image as well. You can see they're in the exact same poses, and particularly you'll see this guy in all the images I'm about to show you, this guy leaning with his hand on his chin in front of the women holding the baby. In all of the images you're about to see, that exact configuration exists. Here's that exact configuration again. This one from a painting done 30 years later. Here's another one from about 10 years later. But again, look at the configurations of the people. They're exactly the same. They're copies of each other's paintings. Here's a book illustration from 1829. It's the exact same. This is a print, it's an engraving, a copper engraving, so it's not in color, it's not a painting, but the composition is exactly the same, right down to that guy leaning on his chin in the foreground there. This appears to be the original painting. It's done by a man named Herbert Binney. It's in the Nova Scotia Museum. He was a collector of customs in Halifax in the late 18th and early 19th century. And it looks like it's something he may have done based on an earlier watercolor that he may have done while visiting these people in the country. Or maybe he saw another print, or maybe somebody told him. But again, we don't know anything. Again, what we do know is that the image keeps getting repeated over and over again. There we are. 6 images over 4 decades apart, all with that same basic composition, all with the exact same cluster of figures. So there we go. 6 paintings, again, often used as illustrations of Eastern Algonquian peoples, particularly of Mi'kmaq peoples, but Eastern Algonquian peoples in general. The Mi'kmaq were primarily in Nova Scotia, but certainly ranged into New Brunswick, ranged into Prince Edward Island, ranged into eastern Quebec and down the St. Lawrence River Valley, often reported being seen in around Quebec City. So that image of them outside Quebec City is plausible, except it's the same people. So what do these examples tell us about the authenticity of what we see in these historical illustrations? It means that we have to apply the same critical lens to an illustration that we do to a textual document. We need to know who made this document. We need to know when they made it. We need to know under what conditions they made this. We certainly need to know if it's original, if they were on the scene, if they're actually painting or drawing something that they actually saw, as opposed to copying somebody else's work or some preconceived, perhaps even stereotypical notion of what's going on there. We simply don't know in these cases. We have no record whatsoever to tell us that there's an original drawing that's actually based on looking at Indigenous people. That guy leaning on his chin in all those paintings, that could be anybody. It certainly could be any guy doing that. And we don't really know if there's an authentic family there, an authentic village setting or anything of the sort. So we need to be careful when we look at these materials. We need to be careful when we read these things to understand what we may or may not be looking at.